As investigators spent years looking for a suspect, a key clue was buried in their files. Could they have solved the case years earlier? They called it the Polygon. Using phone records and a sophisticated system that maps the reach of cell towers, a team of investigators had drawn the irregular shape across a map of tree-lined streets in the Long Island suburb of Massapequa Park. By 2021, the investigators had been able to shrink the polygon so that it covered only several hundred homes. In one of those homes, investigators believed lived their serial killer. A decade before, 11 bodies had been found in the underbrush around Gilgo Beach, a remote stretch of sand 5 miles away on the south shore. 4 women had been bound with tape or belts or wrapped in shrouds of camouflage patterned burlap, the sort that hunters use for blinds. They had worked as escorts and had gone missing after going to meet a client. Each, shortly before she disappeared, had been in contact with a different burner cell phone. Investigators eventually determined that during the workday, some of the phones had been in a small area of Midtown Manhattan near Penn Station. And at night, they pinged in the Polygon, mirroring the tidal movements of the 150,000 Long Island residents who head into Manhattan each day. Last Friday, Suffolk County authorities announced they had arrested a man who they believed had killed 4 women. Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect who had an office near Penn Station and lived on a quiet street where they had expected to find him. He was charged with 3 of the murders, to which he has pleaded not guilty and was named as the prime suspect in the 4th. The authorities ended years of anguish for some of the victims' families, but the investigation also raised questions and an unsettling question. Could the authorities have solved the case years earlier? The following account is drawn from a 32-page bail application and the interviews with current and former investigators and Suffolk County's top law enforcement officials. The case had unfolded fitfully over more than a decade, but it took a new police commissioner and his task force just weeks to uncover a crucial clue in the sprawling case file. Working under Commissioner Rodney K. Harrison, the core group of about 10 investigators was drawn from his department. The sheriff's office, the FBI, state police worked closely with the district attorney, Ray Tierney of Suffolk County, and his prosecutors. They worked in a beige office, its walls covered with maps, photos, and a giant timeline scouring their suspects' digital and daily life, email addresses, social media accounts, search histories. All the while, Mr. Heuermann was searching too, asking Google the same question that so many of his neighbors had been asking each other for more than a decade. Why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? Picking up on the trail of a serial killer is an exceptional challenge. The killer often has no personal connection to the victims. If the victims lived on society's margins, months or years can go by before their disappearances are treated as serious matters or even recognized as the work of a single murderer. The realization that a serial killer was hunting on Long Island's South Shore came in December 2010 when a Suffolk County police officer, John Malia, and his canine partner, a German Shepherd named Blue, were searching for a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert who'd gone missing in the area. Instead, over several days, they found 4 other bodies near Gilgo Beach. They'd been placed roughly 10 yards from Ocean Parkway, the main east-west thoroughfare that traverses a barrier island off the South Shore. After they discovered the bodies, investigators searched for evidence nearby with meticulous care, sifting the sand like gold miners around each body, one investigator recounted. Miss Gilbert's corpse and other remains, including those that the authorities described as a man wearing women's clothing and a toddler, would be found along the same roadway over the following year. The grisly discoveries riveted the region as police speculated that the killings might be the work of more than one person. But the first 4 bodies, all petite women in their 20s who had gone missing in the previous 4 years, seemed linked. Investigators surmised that they had been killed by the same man, in part because of the way the bodies were wrapped and their proximity to each other. And there was reason to believe that a witness might have gotten a look at the man. The last of the four to disappear had been Amber Costello, a 27-year-old with KAOS tattoo on her neck who advertised on Backpage and Craigslist. Shortly before she was last seen in September of 2010, a would-be client contacted her from a disposable phone and visited her at the West Babylon house she shared with 3 roommates, parking in her driveway according to court papers filed after Mr. Heuermann's arrest. He drove a vehicle with a distinctive look. It was an SUV in the front and a pickup truck in the back. The driver was just as distinctive, hulking in his 40s with bushy dark hair and a 1970s style eyeglasses. A witness described him as an ogre. But as soon as the would-be client paid Miss Costello, a chaotic scene unfolded. A man pretending to be the outraged boyfriend rushed in, part of a ruse to steal the money, according to court papers. Startled, the hulking man rushed out of the house. He did not disappear for long, though. He texted Miss Costello asking for, quote-unquote, credit the next time, and arranged another meeting, according to the court papers. Miss Costello was last seen alive the next night, walking out of her home, apparently to meet the man. Not long after, a witness reported seeing a dark truck drive by. The description of the vehicle in the driveway, a dark, first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, ended up tucked away in the case files, the authorities said. The fact apparently lay buried for years among hundreds of thousands of pages of interviews, telephone, travel, credit records, and endless tips as Suffolk County Police Department and District Attorney's Office endured years of turmoil. James Burke, the swaggering police chief who had been running the department since 2012, was arrested in 2015 and later convicted on federal civil rights and obstruction of justice charges. He had beaten a suspect who had been arrested after stealing cigars and a bag containing pornography and sex toys from Mr. Burke's sport utility vehicle. The subsequent cover-up ensnared the district attorney at the time, James Spota, who also landed in prison. The federal investigation into Suffolk County's top lawmen spanned years during the Gilgo Beach case, a period during which both Mr. Burke and Mr. Spota had spurned help from the FBI. After Mr. Burke's arrest, the new head of Suffolk County Police, Tenny Sini, redoubled the department's efforts. Mr. Sini, a former Manhattan federal prosecutor, focused on tracking the disposable cell phones, hoping there were more clues to be gleaned. FBI agents in 2012 had already identified the area where coverage from 4 cell towers overlapped in Massapequa Park. By mid-2016, Mr. Sini had secured a court order for tower dumps, information on every phone that connected to particular towers in a given window of time. Technology and software had advanced, and Mr. Sini had invested in a system that allowed investigators to take the relevant areas, as he told Newsday, and shrink them to extremely manageable spaces. They whittled down the area to what they came to call the polygon, which left them with several hundred homes around First Avenue in Massapequa Park, officials said. A pattern emerged from the disposable phones used to contact the victims. In the evening, nighttime, and pre-dawn hours, somewhere in a small area of Massapequa Park, a person with knowledge about the investigation had said. That's also where the phone of one of the victims, Megan Waterman, last logged in at 3:11 a.m. on the 6th of June, 2010, shortly before. Among other communications that investigators scrutinized were sadistic, taunting calls that someone made from the cell phone of one of the victims, Melissa Barthélemy, to her teenage sister shortly after she disappeared in 2009. "Do you ever think you'll speak to her again?" the person had asked in a bland, calm voice. Those calls were also linked to cell towers near Penn Station. For years, investigators looked for suspects who worked in Manhattan and had lived in the Polygon. The going was slow. A big break came in March of 2022. Just weeks after the formation of a new task force, an investigator found the witness description of the Chevrolet Avalanche in a case file. Using a database, he was able to search vehicles by make and model without the license plate number. He found an Avalanche linked to Mr. Heuermann in 2010, the same year that Ms. Costello had gone missing. His name had never come up in the investigation as a suspect, officials said. His physical description matched that of the ogreish man who had rushed out of the house shortly before she disappeared. He was 6'4" and heavy-set. His office was in the patch of Manhattan that was identified by the sophisticated cell phone mapping technique. He also lived in what investigators believed was their serial killer sweet spot, the park of Massapequa Park, where they'd begun drawing their polygon. The Avalanche lead had been pretty much known from the beginning, and no one knew why investigators had not pursued it. It was suggested that perhaps the detail hadn't been thought to be credible, or it had sunk down in significance amid what seemed like more promising leads. There are so many piles of evidence, there's what's credible, what's not credible, what seems likely, what's not likely, so it becomes very hard to sift through all of these various piles. But crimes are often solved, and cases often start with a car description. David Berkowitz, son of Sam, and perhaps the state's most notorious killer, was arrested in the 70s after police found that he owned an illegally parked Ford Galaxy then had received a parking ticket near one of the shootings. In the Gilgo Beach investigation, the critical clue had fallen through the cracks. If they knew about Dominique Verone, the former chief of detectives who oversaw the first year of the investigation, questioned whether the Avalanche clue had actually been in the case file, but he also added that he would feel very, very badly if our team had missed something. When investigators did finally link the Chevrolet Avalanche to Mr. Heuermann, the investigation entered a critical phase. Investigators began exploring every aspect of his life using 300 subpoenas and search warrants. They examined his Tinder account and several email addresses, all made with fictitious names, and that led to additional disposable phones that Mr. Heuermann was using to contact massage parlors, women working as escorts. They found searches for child pornography, among other things. The more investigators learned about Mr. Heuermann, the more convinced they were that he was the suspect. So much time had passed since the killings that the precise locational data for Mr. Heuermann's personal cell phone that was registered to his architectural business no longer existed. But his billing records showed the general location of the cell phone when the calls were made, and putting it in New York City around the same time in 2010 that the taunting calls were made on Miss Barthelemy's cell phone. Investigators learned that several of the murders had occurred when Mr. Heuermann's wife and children were out of town. One coincided with a trip his wife took to Iceland, another took place when she was in Maryland, and a third took place when she was in New Jersey. But they had nothing to put the burner phones that had been in contact with the victims in Mr. Heuermann's hands, nor did they have any physical forensic evidence linking him to the crimes. In the investigation's early days, at least 5 hairs were discovered on the victims or stuck to the burlap or duct tape that enveloped them, and at the time they were deemed unsuitable for DNA analysis. Since that time, forensic science has moved ahead. In the past 3 years, 2 outside laboratories were able to generate through DNA reports. When investigators did finally link the Chevrolet Avalanche to Mr. Heuermann, the investigation entered a critical phase. Investigators began exploring every aspect of his life using 300 subpoenas and search warrants. They examined his Tinder account and several email addresses, all made with fictitious names, and that led to additional disposable phones that Mr. Heuermann was using to contact massage parlors, women working as escorts. They found searches for child pornography, among other things. The more investigators learned about Mr. Heuermann, the more convinced they were that he was the suspect. So much time had passed since the killings that the precise locational data for Mr. Heuermann's personal cell phone that was registered to his architectural business no longer existed. But his billing records showed the general location of the cell phone when the calls were made, and putting it in New York City around the same time in 2010 that the taunting calls were made on Miss Barthelemy cell phone. Investigators learned that several of the murders had occurred when Mr. Heuermann's wife and children were out of town. One coincided with a trip his wife took to Iceland, another took place when she was in Maryland, and a third took place when she was in New Jersey. But they had nothing to put the burner phones that had been in contact with the victims in Mr. Heuermann's hands, nor did they have any physical forensic evidence linking him to the crimes. In the investigation's early days, at least 5 hairs were discovered on the victims or stuck to the burlap or duct tape that enveloped them, and at the time they were deemed unsuitable. Now, investigators needed genetic material from Mr. Heuermann. Last July, an undercover detective rooted through his recycling for empty bottles. In January, Mr. Heuermann tossed a pizza box into a sidewalk garbage can outside of his office in Midtown Manhattan. A surveillance team flushed it out, and its ragged crusts were sent to the lab for evaluation. Investigators concluded that most of the hairs found on the victims were likely to have come from Mr. Heuermann's wife. One was a potential match for Mr. Heuermann himself. One laboratory compared the DNA profile from the 5th hair to the genetic material found on the Heuermann pizza. It found enough common markers that while 99.96% of the population could be excluded, Mr. Heuermann could not be excluded. Mr. Tierney learned of the results of this test in June. He read the report again and again, perhaps dozens of times, as if trying to convince himself of what his eyes were seeing. Investigators now believe they had direct evidence linking Mr. Heuermann to the killings. But investigators knew something else. Mr. Heuermann was scouring the internet for information on what law enforcement was doing. Internet searches linked to his anonymous accounts included more than 200 queries in the past 16 months about serial killers generally, and the investigation into the Gilgo Beach victims specifically. In quotes, why could law enforcement not trace the calls made by Long Island serial killer, ? Was just one of the search entries. Mr. Tierney had grown increasingly worried that the victims would drop on his watch. He said that Mr. Tierney had grown increasingly worried that more victims would drop while on his watch. He said that Mr. Heuermann had been visiting massage parlors and contacting women working as escorts. Mr. Tierney said he was sleeping poorly. He was bedeviled by tension and worry. So last week he decided the case had reached a tipping point. On the evening of July 13th, as Mr. Heuermann was leaving his Midtown office in Manhattan, detectives in suits and ties approached him like so many men in black after he walked out of his office building. Mr. Heuermann, prosecutors said, had methodically covered his tracks and closely monitored the investigation. But when the detectives arrested Mr. Heuermann, after more than a dozen years of pursuit, Mr. Tierney said his reaction was very simple and instinctive. It was that of genuine surprise.